Thomas had been digging in the frozen ground for what felt like forever. 18 long months of breaking his back with a pickaxe and shovel, and what did he have to show for it? A few tiny specks of gold that wouldn't even buy him a decent meal. Back in Seattle, he stood up slowly, feeling every ache in his 32-year-old body. His hands were so rough and cracked that they looked like old leather gloves. The cold Alaska air bit at his face as he looked down at his latest hole in the ground. Nothing. Again, the creek beside his small wooden cabin bubbled quietly, almost like it was mocking him. Willow Creek, he called it, though he wasn't even sure if that was its real name. He had found this spot on an old map that some drunk prospector had sold him for $5 back in Skagway. Best $5 he ever spent, the man had said with a toothless grin. Thomas was starting to think. He'd been fooled. His cabin was barely big enough for one person. Just 4 walls, a roof that leaked when it rained, and a small stone fireplace that he'd built himself. The whole thing creaked and groaned whenever the wind picked up, which was almost every night. Sometimes he wondered if the cabin would still be standing when he woke up in the morning. Inside, his supplies were running dangerously low. 3 cans of beans sat on the rough wooden shelf he'd hammered into the wall. A bag of flour that was more bug than grain. Some coffee that tasted like dirt but kept him going. And hardtack biscuits so hard he had to soak them in hot water just to bite through them. Every morning was the same routine. Wake up before sunrise, make coffee that could strip paint, eat whatever he could find, and then head out to dig. The work was backbreaking. First, he had to break through the frozen topsoil with his pickaxe. In Alaska, the ground stayed frozen most of the year, even a few feet down. Then came the careful work of sifting through dirt and gravel, looking for any sign of the yellow metal that had brought thousands of men north, the 1896 gold. Rush had started in the Klondike, but Thomas figured everyone else would head there. Too many people meant too much competition. So he'd struck out on his own, following rumors and half-drawn maps to this remote spot in Alaska Territory. It seemed smart at the time. Now, he wasn't so sure his nearest neighbor was a gruff old-timer named Pete who lived 3 days' walk downstream. Thomas had met him only twice. The first time, Pete had warned him about the long winter coming. The second time, Pete had tried to convince him to give up and head south before the snow got too deep. That was 2 months ago, and Thomas hadn't seen another soul since. The loneliness was almost worse than the hunger. He found himself talking to the creek, to his tools, even to the ravens that watched him work from the tall spruce trees. Sometimes he would stop digging just to hear his own voice echo off the mountains. The silence up here was so complete it felt like a weight pressing down on him. At night, he would sit by his small fire and read the same 3 books over and over. A Bible his mother had given him, though he wasn't much for religion these days. A book about mining techniques that promised easy riches but delivered only complicated diagrams. And a collection of poems that made him think of home and the life he'd left behind. Back in Oregon, he'd been a schoolteacher. Can you imagine that? Thomas laughed bitterly at the thought. He'd worn a clean shirt every day, taught children their letters, and went home to a warm house and hot meals. But when the gold fever hit and men started coming back from Alaska with their pockets full of nuggets, the teaching life seemed small and ordinary. His sister had begged him not to go. "You don't know anything about mining," she'd said. "You've never even been camping." She was right, of course. But something inside him needed to try. Maybe it was the promise of quick riches. Maybe it was the adventure. Or maybe he was just tired of living such a quiet, predictable life. Now, as winter crept closer each day, he was starting to understand what real hardship meant. The temperature dropped below freezing most nights, even in what passed for summer up here. Soon it would be cold enough to kill a man if he wasn't careful. And when the deep winter came, he would be completely cut off from the outside world until spring. His food situation was becoming desperate. The beans wouldn't last another week. The flour was almost gone. And his coffee supply was down to maybe 10 days if he stretched it thin. He tried fishing in the creek, but his luck there was about as good as his luck finding gold he'd caught. Exactly 3 fish in 18 months. And they were all so small he could finish one in 3 bites. The work itself was wearing him down in ways he'd never expected. His shoulders ached constantly from swinging the pickaxe. His knees were shot from kneeling by the creek to pan for gold. And his hands were in such bad shape that simple tasks like buttoning his shirt had become difficult, but it wasn't just the physical toll, the mental strain was maybe worse. Every day brought the same crushing disappointment. Every shovel full of dirt that contained nothing valuable. Every pan of creek water that showed only rocks and sand. The hope that had carried him north was slowly dying, replaced by a grim determination that was more stubborn than smart. He'd heard stories of men who'd spent years looking for gold and found nothing. Men who died alone in cabins like this. Their bodies not discovered until spring. Men who'd gone crazy from the isolation and wandered off into the wilderness never to be seen again. Was he becoming one of those men? The question haunted him as he prepared for another night in his creaky cabin. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the whole structure shake. The temperature was dropping fast, and he could see his breath in the air. Winter was coming whether he was ready or not. He added another log to his fire and tried not to think about what would happen when his supplies ran out completely. The nearest town was a week's journey away, assuming the weather held. And he didn't have enough food to make the trip? He was trapped here until he either found gold or found a way to survive on nothing. As he settled into his thin blankets for another uncomfortable night, Thomas wondered if he would ever see his sister again. Would he ever stand in front of a classroom full of children? Would he ever sleep in a real bed or eat a meal he didn't have to cook over an open fire? The answers to those questions lay somewhere in the frozen ground around Willow Creek, and tomorrow he would get up and start digging again, hoping that this would finally be the day his luck changed. The beans were almost gone. Thomas stared at the empty can in his hands, scraping out the last few drops of juice with his finger. October had arrived with a vengeance, bringing freezing rain and winds that cut through his worn jacket like it was made of paper. The nights were getting longer, and he could feel winter closing in around his little cabin like a trap. He'd managed to catch a small rabbit 2 days ago, but that meat was already finished. His stomach growled constantly now, a hollow ache that had become his constant companion. The hardtack biscuits were so stale they could probably stop a bullet, but he soaked them in hot water and ate them anyway. Food was food, even if it tasted like cardboard. The fire in his small stone fireplace was burning low. He needed to go out and gather more wood before dark, but his body felt heavy and tired. 18 months of this life had worn him down to nothing. He was probably 30 pounds lighter than when he'd arrived, and his clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else. As he stirred the weak soup he'd made from the last of his beans, Thomas heard something that made him freeze. Footsteps, actual human footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves outside his cabin. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It had been so long since he'd seen another person that he sometimes imagined voices in the wind, but no, there it was again. Slow, careful steps coming closer to his door. His heart started beating faster. Out here, visitors could mean anything. Maybe it was Pete, the old prospector from downstream. Maybe it was someone lost and looking for help. Or maybe it was someone dangerous, looking to rob what little he had left. Thomas grabbed the old rifle he kept by the door. It only had 3 bullets left, but he hoped he wouldn't need to use any of them. He pulled back the thin curtain and peered out the small window. What he saw made him blink hard, sure he was seeing things. A young native girl stood in the clearing in front of his cabin. She couldn't have been more than 16 years old, maybe younger. She was wrapped in what looked like traditional clothing made from cedar bark and animal hide. Her long black hair was braided with small beads that caught the last light of the gray afternoon. In her hands she carried a worn leather pouch that looked old and well-used. She stood perfectly still, about 20 feet from his door, waiting. She wasn't trying to hide or sneak around. She was just standing there, patient as the mountains themselves. When she saw his face in the window, She raised one hand in what was clearly a peaceful greeting. Thomas set down his rifle and opened the door slowly. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he stepped outside anyway. The girl watched him carefully, her dark eyes taking in his ragged appearance, his too thin frame, his nervous movements. "Hello," she said in English that was clear but careful, like each word took effort. "I am looking for the white man who digs in the water." Her voice was soft but carried clearly in the still air. Thomas realized she meant him, but how did she know about his prospecting? He hadn't seen anyone in months. Who was this girl, and how had she found him? "That would be me," he said, his own voice cracking from not being used much lately. Thomas, who are you?" The girl took a small step forward, still moving slowly and carefully. "My name is Annie. I come from the village of my people, 2 days walking from here. My grandfather, he sends me to find you." 2 days walking? Thomas looked at her with new respect. That was rough country out there, full of bears and wolves, and 100 ways to die. This girl had traveled through all of that alone just to find him. "But why? Your grandfather sent you?" Thomas asked. "I don't understand." "I don't know your grandfather. I don't know anyone around here except maybe old Pete downstream," Anne added seriously. "My grandfather is very old. Very wise. He has dreams sometimes. Dreams that show him things that will happen. He had dreams about you." "Dreams?" Thomas felt a mix of skepticism and curiosity. He didn't put much stock in dreams and visions, but something about the way this girl spoke made him listen anyway. She had walked 2 days through dangerous wilderness to deliver a message from an old man who dreamed about him. That took either courage or craziness, and she seemed too calm to be crazy. "What kind of dreams?" he asked, stepping closer, but still keeping some distance. Annie reached into her leather pouch and pulled out something wrapped in soft hide. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small piece of carved bone. The carving showed water flowing around rocks with tiny symbols that Thomas didn't recognize. "My grandfather dreams of the white man who digs in the sacred waters," she said, holding up the carving. "He sees you working, always working, but finding nothing. He sees you getting thin and tired. He sees winter coming and you not ready." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. This description was uncomfortably accurate. How could some old native man he'd never met know so much about his situation? "He also dreams of yellow tears," Annie continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Yellow tears that flow from the mountain when the spirits are willing to share their gifts." Yellow tears, gold. Thomas's heart started beating faster again. Was this girl talking about gold? But why would her grandfather care about helping a white stranger find gold? "I don't understand," Thomas said honestly. "Why would your grandfather want to help me? I'm nobody special. I'm just a man trying to make a living." Annie wrapped the bone carving carefully and put it back in her pouch. "My grandfather says the spirits of this place are unhappy. You dig in the wrong places." "You do not ask permission. You do not understand the old ways. This makes the spirits angry, and angry spirits bring bad luck to everyone." That hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Bad luck was exactly what he'd been having. 18 months of the worst luck imaginable. Could there really be something to what this girl was saying? "But also," Annie continued, "my grandfather sees that you are not a bad man. You work hard. You do not give up even when things are very difficult. The spirits respect this. They are willing to help, but only if you do things the right way." The right way. Thomas had been approaching his mining like any other job back in Oregon. Dig here, dig there, follow the basic techniques he'd read about in his book. It had never occurred to him that the land itself might have rules he needed to follow. "What does your grandfather want me to do?" Thomas asked. Annie looked up at the darkening sky. Night was coming fast, and she was still far from home. "He wants me to show you where to dig, but not tonight. Tonight I must rest. Tomorrow, if you are willing to listen, I will show you what my grandfather sees in his dreams." Thomas looked at this brave young girl who had traveled so far to help a stranger. His rational mind told him this was all nonsense. Dreams and spirits and sacred waters. But his desperate situation told him something else. He had tried everything he could think of and nothing had worked. Maybe it was time to try something different. "You can't travel in the dark," he said finally. "It's too dangerous. You should stay here tonight. I don't have much food, but I'll share what I have." Annie smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "Thank you, Thomas, who digs in the water. My grandfather said you would be kind." Thomas woke up the next morning to find Annie already awake, sitting quietly by the dying fire. She had slept on the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket he'd given her. Somehow she looked perfectly comfortable, like sleeping on a hard wooden floor was nothing unusual for her. Thomas, meanwhile, had barely slept at all. His mind had been spinning with questions and doubts about this strange visitor and her grandfather's dreams. The morning air was crisp and cold. Frost covered the windows, and Thomas could see his breath inside the cabin. Winter was definitely coming, and fast. He needed to focus on finding gold soon, or he'd be in real trouble. The last thing he needed was distractions, even well-meaning ones. "Good morning," Annie said softly as Thomas stretched and tried to work the kinks out of his back. "Are you ready to see what my grandfather wants to show you?" Thomas looked at her skeptically. In the harsh light of morning, last night's conversation seemed even more unbelievable. Dreams and spirits and sacred waters. It all sounded like the kind of stories people told around campfires to scare children. He was a practical man, a former schoolteacher who believed in facts and hard work, not superstitions. "Look, Annie," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle but firm. "I appreciate you coming all this way, I really do. But I don't have time for stories about dreams and spirits. I've got maybe 3 weeks before the snow gets too deep to work. If I don't find gold by then, I'm finished." Annie stood up slowly, folding the blanket with careful precision. "My grandfather's dreams are not stories, Thomas. They are visions of what is and what can be. He has helped our people survive for many winters because he listens to what the spirits tell him." Thomas felt his patience wearing thin. He'd heard similar claims from medicine men and fortune tellers back in the towns. People always claimed they had special knowledge or could see the future. But it was always just tricks and nonsense designed to separate desperate people from their money. "I'm sure your grandfather is a wise man," Thomas said, pulling on his boots. "But I've been studying this creek for 18 months. I know every rock, every bend, every deep spot. I've read books about geology and mining techniques. I've tried everything the experts recommend. What could an old man who's never even seen a mining operation possibly know about finding gold?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but Thomas was frustrated. He was running out of time and options, and he couldn't afford to waste precious days following some old man's dreams. This was about survival, not spirituality. Annie's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes grew colder. "You think wisdom only comes from books? You think the white man's way is the only way to understand the earth?" "That's not what I meant," Thomas said quickly, but he could see he'd offended her. "I just mean that mining is a science. There are proven methods, tested techniques. You can't just dig anywhere and hope for the best." "And how well have your proven methods worked?" Annie asked quietly. "How much gold have you found in 18 months using the white man's science?" The question hit him like a slap. The answer was embarrassing. In all his months of scientific digging and careful planning, he'd found maybe an ounce of gold. Barely enough to buy a week's worth of supplies. His methods weren't working, but that didn't mean some mystical alternative would work either. "That's different," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure how. "Just because I haven't been successful yet doesn't mean the methods are wrong. Maybe this creek just doesn't have much gold. Maybe I need to try a different location." Annie picked up her leather pouch and slung it over her shoulder. "My grandfather said you would say this. He said the white men always think they know better, even when their way brings them nothing but hunger and sadness." Thomas felt his temper starting to rise. Who was this girl to criticize him? She'd lived her whole life in some primitive village, probably never seen a real city or gone to school or read a book. What did she know about the modern world and its methods? Look, he said, his voice getting louder, I didn't ask for your grandfather's help. I didn't ask for dreams or visions or whatever this is supposed to be. I came here to work, not to listen to old superstitions. Superstitions? Annie's voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. You call the wisdom of my people superstitions? The knowledge that has kept us alive in this land for hundreds of generations? Thomas immediately regretted his choice of words, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I call it superstition when someone claims they can find gold through dreams. Gold doesn't care about spirits or ceremonies. It's a metal. It follows geological rules. It gets deposited by water action and geological processes, not by magic. Annie stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could see disappointment in her young face. You are like the other white men who have come to our land. You see only what you want to take, not what is really here. You dig and blast and tear up the earth, but you never listen to what it's trying to tell you. The earth doesn't talk, Thomas said flatly. It's dirt and rock and water, that's all. No, Annie said, shaking her head sadly. That is where you are wrong. Everything talks if you know how to listen. The water tells you where it has been. The rocks tell you what they have seen. The plants tell you what lives beneath them. But you white men make too much noise to hear anything. Thomas had heard enough. This conversation was going nowhere, and he was wasting precious daylight. Every minute he spent arguing with this girl was a minute he could have been digging. Winter was coming whether he found gold or not, and philosophical debates about talking rocks weren't going to fill his empty stomach. I appreciate your grandfather's concern, he said, moving toward the door, but I need to get to work. You're welcome to head back to your village, or you can watch me dig if you want. But I'm not changing my methods based on some old man's dreams. Annie followed him outside, where the morning sun was just starting to warm the frost-covered ground. Thomas picked up his tools and headed toward his usual digging spot, the same area he'd been working for weeks. He could feel the girl watching him, but he tried to ignore her presence. That is not the place, Annie said when she saw where he was heading. This is exactly the place, Thomas replied stubbornly. The geology here is perfect. There's a natural catchment where heavy materials would settle. The water flow is just right. Every textbook would say this is the ideal spot for placer deposits. Your textbooks are wrong, Annie said simply. Thomas spun around to face her, his frustration finally boiling over. Wrong? These techniques have been used successfully all over the world. They found gold in California, Australia, South Africa. Professional geologists developed these methods through years of scientific study. And yet you have found nothing, Annie pointed out. The simple truth of her statement made Thomas even angrier. He didn't want to admit that maybe his scientific approach wasn't working. He didn't want to consider that 18 months of careful, methodical work might have been completely wasted. That possibility was too painful to face. Maybe there just isn't any gold here, he said defensively. Maybe this whole area is played out. That doesn't mean the methods are wrong. Annie walked over to the edge of his digging site and knelt down. She scooped up a handful of dirt and let it run through her fingers, then picked up some of the gravel from his excavation pile. She examined it carefully, even smelling it. There is gold here, she said with quiet certainty. Much gold. But not where you are looking for it. How could you possibly know that? Thomas demanded. You don't have any training in geology or mining. Annie stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. I know because my grandfather taught me to listen. Because my people have lived with this land since before your people knew it existed. Because the spirits of this place have been trying to guide you, but you refuse to hear them. Thomas threw down his shovel in exasperation. This was hopeless. He was trying to have a rational conversation with someone who believed in spirits and magic. It was like trying to explain mathematics to a child who insisted that numbers could feel emotions. Fine, he said, show me. If your grandfather's dreams are so accurate, show me where I should dig. But when we find nothing but dirt and rocks, I want you to admit that this is all nonsense. Annie looked at him sadly, like she was looking at Someone who was very sick but refused to take medicine. My grandfather said you would need to see for yourself. He said your pride would not let you believe until the earth itself proved him right. She turned and started walking upstream, away from his carefully chosen digging site. Against his better judgment, Thomas found himself following her, his tools in his hands and doubt gnawing at his heart. Thomas expected Annie to leave after their argument. Any reasonable person would have walked away from someone so stubborn and rude. But when he looked out his cabin window the next morning, there she was. She had made a small camp about 100 yards away, just at the edge of the tree line, where the tall spruce trees met the open area around his claim. Her camp was simple, but well organized. She had built a small lean-to shelter using fallen branches and what looked like bark sheets. A tiny fire pit sat in front of it, with stones carefully arranged in a circle. Everything was neat and purposeful, like she'd done this many times before. Thomas had to admit, grudgingly, that she knew how to take care of herself in the wilderness. He tried to ignore her presence as he went about his morning routine. Coffee that tasted like mud, a breakfast of soaked hardtack that had all the flavor of wet cardboard, and then out to his digging site with his tools. But he could feel her watching him from her camp. Not staring exactly, but keeping an eye on what he was doing. At around midday, when the sun had warmed the air enough to make the work bearable, Annie appeared at the edge of his digging area. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, quietly watching him work. Thomas tried to concentrate on his panning, but her presence was distracting. "I thought you'd be heading home by now," he said without looking up from his pan. "My grandfather told me to stay until you are ready to listen," she replied calmly. Thomas snorted. "Then you might be here all winter." Annie didn't respond to that. Instead, she walked closer and knelt down beside the creek. She cupped some water in her hands and let it run through her fingers, watching how it flowed. Then she picked up some of the gravel from the creek bed and examined it closely. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, despite himself. "Learning," she said simply. "The water here moves too fast. It carries the heavy things away instead of letting them settle. This is why you find so little." Thomas felt his irritation rising again. The water speed is perfect for placer mining. Fast enough to wash away the lighter sediments, slow enough to let the gold settle out. It's basic physics. Annie stood up and moved upstream a little, still studying the water flow. "Physics." She repeated the word like she was tasting something strange. "Is that another word for not listening?" "Physics is science," Thomas said firmly. "It's how the world actually works, not how people imagine it works." Was all Annie said to that. The next morning, she was still there. This time she had something new with her. When Thomas emerged from his cabin, he saw her arranging small items on a flat rock near her camp. Dried fish, what looked like tea made from pine needles, and some kind of bread or cake wrapped in leaves. She stood up when she saw him and walked halfway between their camps, carrying one of the items. It was the dried fish, and even from a distance, Thomas could smell how good it was. His mouth started watering immediately. He hadn't had decent protein in weeks. "For you," she said, holding out the fish. "You are too thin. Winter will be hard." "If you do not eat better," Thomas wanted to refuse. Accepting her food felt like admitting he needed help, which he definitely didn't want to do. But his hungry body had other ideas. Almost without thinking, he reached out and took the fish. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I can't pay you for it." "I do not want payment," Annie said. "Hungry people make poor decisions. Fed people think." More clearly, the fish was delicious. Better than anything Thomas had eaten in months. It was smoky and rich, preserved in a way that kept all the flavor while making it last. He tried to eat it slowly, to make it last, but he was so hungry that he finished it in minutes. "How did you preserve this?" he asked. "Always," Annie said. "My grandmother taught me before she crossed over to the spirit world. Fish must be cut just right, smoked at the right temperature with the right wood. Takes 3 days to do properly." Thomas found himself curious despite his determination to stay focused on his work. "What kind of wood?" "Alder is best. Burns clean, gives good flavor. Cedar works too, but makes the fish taste different. Spruce will work if you have nothing else, but it is not as good. It was practical knowledge, the kind of thing that could mean the difference between life and death out here. Thomas had read about food preservation in books, but this girl knew it from experience. She had skills that could actually be useful. Still, he reminded himself, food preservation wasn't gold mining. Different subjects entirely. That afternoon, Annie appeared again while he was working. This time she brought a small bundle of carved tools made from bone and antler. She set them down on a flat rock and began working on something, sitting close enough to talk but far enough away to not interfere with his digging. "What are those?" Thomas asked, gesturing at her tools. "For working hide," she said, holding up what looked like a bone needle. "Winter is coming. You will need warmer clothes." Thomas looked down at his worn jacket and pants. They were in pretty bad shape, full of holes and tears from months of hard work. The jacket especially was more patches than original fabric at this point. A good winter coat would definitely be useful. "I don't have any hide to work," he said. "I do," Annie replied. "Rabbit hide, deer hide, warm and light. Better than the cloth clothes you wear." She was right, and Thomas knew it. His store-bought clothes were designed for Oregon weather, not Alaska winters. But accepting her help with clothes felt like a bigger step than accepting food. Food was temporary, but clothes were something more permanent. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "Why are you helping me?" Annie continued working with her tools as she answered. "My grandfather says the spirits want you to succeed, but they also want you to learn. You cannot learn if you die from cold or hunger before the lesson is complete." "What lesson?" "That there are many ways to understand the world. Your books teach you one way, my people know other ways. Both can be true at the same time." Thomas thought about that as he continued panning. He'd always believed that there was one right way to do things and many wrong ways. The idea that multiple approaches could all be correct at the same time seemed impossible. How could science and superstition both be right? The next day brought even more surprises. Annie showed up with what looked like a tea made from local plants. She offered it to Thomas with the explanation that it would help prevent scurvy, a disease that killed many prospectors who didn't eat properly. "How do you know about scurvy?" Thomas asked, surprised. "White men have been coming to our land for many years," Annie said. "We have seen what happens when they do not eat the right foods. We know which plants can help." The tea tasted bitter but not unpleasant. More importantly, Thomas could feel his energy returning after drinking it. He'd been feeling weak and tired lately, probably from his poor diet. This simple tea seemed to help almost immediately. Over the following days, Annie continued her quiet campaign of assistance. She brought him pine needle tea rich in vitamins. She showed him which local berries were safe to eat and which ones to avoid. She even demonstrated how to build a more efficient fire that would burn longer and give off more heat. Each gift, each lesson, came with no pressure and no demands. She never asked him to stop his mining or try her grandfather's method. She just quietly made his life a little easier, a little safer, a little more comfortable. Thomas found himself looking forward to her visits. After months of complete isolation, having someone to talk to was a relief he hadn't expected. Even if they disagreed about mining methods, Annie was intelligent and knowledgeable about many things. Their conversations were the best part of his days. But underneath his growing appreciation for her help, Thomas felt something else growing too. Guilt. This young girl was going out of her way to help him, sharing her food and knowledge. And he was giving her nothing in return except stubbornness and skepticism. She was also taking real risks to help him. Every day she spent here was a day she wasn't with her own people, preparing for winter. If something happened to her while she was helping him, Thomas would never forgive himself. As the days passed and Annie's kindness continued, Thomas began to realize something uncomfortable. Maybe he was wrong about more than just mining techniques. Maybe he was wrong about people and wisdom and the value of different kinds of knowledge, but admitting that would mean admitting that everything he'd been doing for 18 months might have been a mistake. And that was a possibility he still wasn't ready to face. Thomas expected Annie to leave after their argument. Any reasonable person would have walked away from someone so stubborn and rude. But when he looked out his cabin window the next morning, there she was. She had made a small camp about 100 yards away, just at the edge of the tree line, where the tall spruce trees met the open area around his claim. Her camp was simple, but well organized. She had built a small lean-to shelter using fallen branches and what looked like bark sheets. A tiny fire pit sat in front of it, with stones carefully arranged in a circle. Everything was neat and purposeful, like she'd done this many times. Before, Thomas had to admit, grudgingly, that she knew how to take care of herself in the wilderness. He tried to ignore her presence as he went about his morning routine. Coffee that tasted like mud, a breakfast of soaked hardtack that had all the flavor of wet cardboard, and then out to his digging site with his tools. But he could feel her watching him from her camp. Not staring exactly, but keeping an eye on what he was doing. Around midday, when the sun had warmed the air enough to make the work bearable, Annie appeared at the edge of his digging area. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, quietly watching him work. Thomas tried to concentrate on his panning, but her presence was distracting. "I thought you'd be heading home by now," he said without looking up from his pan. "My grandfather told me to stay until you are ready to listen," she replied calmly. Thomas snorted. "Then you might be here all winter." Annie didn't respond to that. Instead, she walked closer and knelt down beside the creek. She cupped some water in her hands and let it run through her fingers, watching how it flowed. Then she picked up some of the gravel from the creek bed and examined it closely. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, despite himself. "Learning," she said simply. "The water here moves too fast. It carries the heavy things away instead of letting them settle. This is why you find so little." Thomas felt his irritation rising again. The water speed is perfect for placer mining. Fast enough to wash away the lighter sediments, slow enough to let the gold settle out. It's basic physics. Annie stood up and moved upstream a little, still studying the water flow. "Physics," she repeated the word like she was tasting something strange. "Is that another word for not listening?" "Physics is science," Thomas said firmly. "It's how the world actually works, not how people imagine it works." Was all Annie said to that. The next morning, she was still there. This time, she had something new with her. When Thomas emerged from his cabin, he saw her arranging small items on a flat rock near her camp. Dried fish, what looked like tea made from pine needles, and some kind of bread or cake wrapped in leaves. She stood up when she saw him and walked halfway between their camps, carrying one of the items. It was the dried fish, and even from a distance, Thomas could smell how good it was. His mouth started watering immediately. He hadn't had decent protein in weeks. "For you," she said, holding out the fish. "You are too thin. Winter will be hard. If you do not eat better," Thomas wanted to refuse. Accepting her food felt like admitting he needed help, which he definitely didn't want to do. But his hungry body had other ideas. Almost without thinking, he reached out and took the fish. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I can't pay you for it." "I do not want payment," Annie said. "Hungry people make poor decisions. Fed people think." More clearly, the fish was delicious. Better than anything Thomas had eaten in months. It was smoky and rich, preserved in a way that kept all the flavor while making it last. He tried to eat it slowly to make it last, but he was so hungry that he finished it in minutes. "How did you preserve this?" he asked. "Old ways," Annie said. "My grandmother taught me before she crossed over to the spirit world. Fish must be cut just right, smoked at the right temperature with the right wood. Takes 3 days to do properly." Thomas found himself curious despite his determination to stay focused on his work. "What kind of wood?" "Alder is best. Burns clean, gives good flavor. Cedar works too, but makes the fish taste different. Spruce will work if you have nothing else, but it is not as good." It was practical knowledge, the kind of thing that could mean the difference between life and death out here. Thomas had read about food preservation in books, but this girl knew it from experience. She had skills that could actually be useful. Still, he reminded himself, food preservation wasn't gold mining. Different subjects entirely. That afternoon, Annie appeared again while he was working. This time she brought a small bundle of carved tools made from bone and antler. She set them down on a flat rock and began working on something, sitting close enough to talk but far enough away to not interfere with his digging. "What are those?" Thomas asked, gesturing at her tools. "For working hide," she said, holding up what looked like a bone needle. "Winter is coming. You will need warmer clothes." Thomas looked down at his worn jacket and pants. They were in pretty bad shape, full of holes and tears from months of hard work. The jacket especially was more patches than original fabric at this point. A good winter coat would definitely be useful. "I don't have any hide to work," he said. "I do," Annie replied. "Rabbit hide, deer hide, warm and light. Better than the cloth clothes you wear." She was right, and Thomas knew it. His store-bought clothes were designed for Oregon weather, not Alaska winters. But accepting her help with clothes felt like a bigger step than accepting food. Food was temporary, but clothes were something more permanent. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "Why are you helping me?" Annie continued working with her tools as she answered. "My grandfather says the spirits want you to succeed, but they also want you to learn. You cannot learn if you die from cold or hunger before the lesson is complete." "What lesson?" "That there are many ways to understand the world. Your books teach you one way, my people know other ways. Both can be true at the same time." Thomas thought about that as he continued panning. He'd always believed that there was one right way to do things and many wrong ways. The idea that multiple approaches could all be correct at the same time seemed impossible. How could science and superstition both be right? The next day brought even more surprises. Annie showed up with what looked like a tea made from local plants. She offered it to Thomas with the explanation that it would help prevent scurvy, a disease that killed many prospectors who didn't eat properly. "How do you know about scurvy?" Thomas asked, surprised. "White men have been coming to our land for many years," Annie said. "We have seen what happens when they do not eat the right foods. We know which plants can help." The tea tasted bitter but not unpleasant. More importantly, Thomas could feel his energy returning after drinking it. He'd been feeling weak and tired lately, probably from his poor diet. This simple tea seemed to help almost immediately. Over the following days, Annie continued her quiet campaign of assistance. She brought him pine needle tea rich in vitamins. She showed him which local berries were safe to eat and which ones to avoid. She even demonstrated how to build a more efficient fire that would burn longer and give off more heat. Each gift, each lesson, came with no pressure and no demands. She never asked him to stop his mining or try her grandfather's method. She just quietly made his life a little easier, a little safer, a little more comfortable. Thomas found himself looking forward to her visits. After months of complete isolation, having someone to talk to was a relief he hadn't expected. Even if they disagreed about mining methods, Annie was intelligent and knowledgeable about many things. Their conversations were the best part of his days. But underneath his growing appreciation for her help, Thomas felt something else growing too: guilt. This young girl was going out of her way to help him, sharing her food and knowledge, and he was giving her nothing in return except stubbornness and skepticism. She was also taking real risks to help him. Every day she spent it was on the seventh day of Annie's presence that everything went wrong. Thomas woke up that morning feeling more frustrated than ever. Another week had passed with nothing to show for it. His latest dig site had produced exactly 3 tiny flakes of gold, barely visible to the naked eye. At this rate, he'd need 1,000 years to find enough gold to pay for his supplies. The weather wasn't helping his mood either. A cold rain had started during the night and showed no signs of stopping. The kind of miserable, soaking rain that cut right through his worn jacket and made every movement uncomfortable. His boots squelched through the mud as he trudged to his digging site, and within minutes his hands were numb with cold. Annie was already awake at her camp, sitting under her lean-to shelter, staying dry and warm. She had a small fire going somehow, despite the rain. Probably another one of her traditional skills that Thomas didn't understand. He felt a stab of irritation at how Kawiri was a day she wasn't with her own people, preparing for winter. If something happened to her while she was helping him, Thomas would never forgive himself. As the days passed and Annie's kindness continued, Thomas began to realize something uncomfortable. Maybe he was wrong about more than just mining techniques. Maybe he was wrong about people and wisdom and the value of different kinds of knowledge, but admitting that would mean admitting that everything he'd been doing for 18 months might have been a mistake. And that was a possibility he still wasn't ready to face. That night was the longest of Thomas's life. He sat alone in his cold cabin, listening to the rain drumming on his leaky roof and thinking about what he'd done. The empty bean can sat on his rough wooden table like an accusation. His last real meal, and he'd eaten it while the taste of his own cruelty was still bitter in his mouth. He kept replaying the fight in his head, hearing his own angry words echo back at him. The look on Annie's face when he'd called her ignorant. The quiet dignity in her voice when she'd pointed out all the ways she was more capable than him. The sadness in her eyes when she'd realized he was too proud to accept help, even when that help might save his life. Sleep was impossible. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw Annie walking away from his camp, her small figure disappearing into the forest. She'd risked her own safety to help a stranger, shared her food when he was hungry, offered her knowledge when he was lost. And he'd repaid her kindness with insults and accusations. The worst part was that she'd been right about everything. He was bitter, he was stubborn. He was so wrapped up in proving he could do everything himself that he'd forgotten how to accept help from another human being. Somewhere along the way, his determination had turned into destructive pride. As the hours dragged by, Thomas found himself thinking about his sister back in Oregon. What would she say if she could see him now? She'd beg him not to come to Alaska, warned him he didn't know what he was getting into. "You're a good teacher, Thomas," she'd said, "but you don't know anything about surviving in the wilderness." She'd been right, too. He'd been so confident, so sure that book learning and determination would be enough. Now, after 18 months of failure, he was facing the possibility that he might die out here. And for what? For some dream of striking it rich that was looking more impossible every day? The rain finally stopped around midnight, but Thomas still couldn't sleep. He got up and paced around his tiny cabin, feeling like a caged animal. 3 steps to the window, turn around. 3 steps to the door, turn around. His whole world had shrunk down to this one small room, and his stubborn refusal to admit he might be wrong. When morning came, Thomas felt worse than ever. His head ached from lack of sleep, his stomach cramped from hunger, and his conscience felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He made his usual terrible coffee and tried to force down some soaked hardtack, but everything tasted like sawdust. He walked outside and looked toward the tree line where Annie's camp had been. Nothing remained except some disturbed earth where her fire pit had been and a few broken branches from her shelter. It was like she'd never been there at all, except for the empty feeling in Thomas's chest that told him something important had been lost. For the first time in months, Thomas didn't pick up his mining tools. What was the point? He could dig from now until Christmas and probably find nothing. His scientific methods, his careful planning, his proven techniques, none of it was working. Maybe it was time to admit that 18 months of failure meant something. Instead of digging, Thomas found himself walking upstream, following the creek in the direction Annie had wanted to show him. He told himself he was just exploring, not following her advice. But deep down, he knew he was looking for some sign of her, some indication of where she'd gone. The creek wound through stands of tall spruce trees, their branches heavy with morning mist. Thomas had never walked this far upstream before. He'd always focused on the area around his cabin, convinced that the best gold deposits would be close to his base of operations. Now he wondered what else he'd missed by being so narrow in his thinking. About a mile upstream, the creek bent sharply around a large granite outcropping. The rock formation was impressive, jutting up from the forest floor like the backbone of some buried giant. Water had carved deep channels around its base over thousands of years, creating pools and eddies that caught Thomas's attention. This was probably the spot Annie had wanted to show him. Thomas could see why her grandfather might have dreamed about this place. There was something almost mystical about it, the way the morning light filtered through the trees and reflected off the wet granite. If you believed in spirits and sacred places, this would definitely qualify, but Thomas forced himself to look at it with a practical eye. The water flow here was different from his usual digging spot. Instead of rushing straight through, the creek slowed and swirled around the granite formation. Heavy materials would settle out in those eddies, exactly the kind of natural trap that collected gold in other successful mining operations. He knelt down and scooped up some gravel from one of the pools. Even without proper panning equipment, he could see that the composition was different here. Darker, heavier sediments that looked promising. The kind of material that might actually contain gold if a person knew how to process it properly. Thomas sat back on his heels and stared at the water. Maybe Annie's grandfather hadn't been talking about magic at all. Maybe his dreams were really just careful observation passed down through generations. Indigenous people had lived in this area for hundreds of years. They would know every creek, every rock formation, every place where the water behaved differently. What if the old man had simply noticed that this spot collected heavy materials? What if his visions were really just practical knowledge wrapped in spiritual language? Thomas had dismissed it as superstition, but maybe he'd been too quick to judge. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Annie had tried to tell him that there were different ways of understanding the world. Maybe her people's way of reading the land was just as valid as his textbook methods, only expressed in different terms. Spirits and dreams instead of geology and physics, but pointing toward the same practical truths. Thomas felt a wave of shame wash over him. He'd been so arrogant, so convinced that his way was the only right way. He'd looked down on Annie's people as primitive and ignorant, when they might actually know things about this land that no amount of book learning could teach him, but it was too late now. Annie was gone, and he had no idea how to find her village. Even if he could find it, why would she or her grandfather want to help him after the way he'd behaved? He'd burned that bridge completely with his cruel words and stubborn pride. As Thomas walked back to his cabin, he tried to imagine what would happen next. Winter was coming fast. His food supplies were almost gone. His mining operation was a complete failure. He had maybe 3 weeks before the snow would make travel impossible, trapping him here until spring. And spring was still 6 months away. He could try to make it to the nearest town, but that was a week's journey through dangerous wilderness. With his poor physical condition and lack of supplies, he might not make it. Or he could stay here and try to survive the winter on what little he had. But that seemed just as hopeless. For the first time since arriving in Alaska, Thomas seriously considered the possibility that he might die out here. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely clarifying. If he was going to die anyway, what did his pride matter? What was the point of being stubborn if stubbornness was going to kill him? That evening, as Thomas sat in his cabin eating what might be his last decent meal for a while, he made a decision that went against every instinct he had. If Annie came back, and that was a big if, he would apologize. He would listen to what she had to say. He would try her grandfather's method, even if it meant admitting that everything he'd believed about mining was wrong. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Thomas was finally desperate enough to swallow it. His pride had gotten him nowhere except hungry and alone. Maybe it was time to try humility instead. As if summoned by his thoughts, Thomas heard a sound that made his heart jump. Footsteps outside his cabin. Slow, careful footsteps approaching. His door. He held his breath, hardly daring to hope. A soft knock came at his door, and Thomas's heart nearly stopped. He knew that knock, gentle but firm, patient but determined. Annie had come back. Thomas stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the door handle. This was his chance to make things right if he was brave enough to take it. Time to find out if he'd learned anything from his mistakes, or if his pride would doom him after all. Thomas opened the door with trembling hands, and there she was. Anne stood in the pale morning light, looking exactly the same as always, calm, patient, and somehow older than her years. But there was something different in her eyes now. A wariness that hadn't been there before, like she was looking at a dangerous animal that might attack again without warning. "Annie," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You came back." She nodded slowly but didn't step closer to the door. "I was walking home to my village when I had a dream. The same dream my grandfather has been having. I saw you digging in the sacred place, but this time you were listening to what the earth was trying to tell you." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after everything he'd said to her, everything cruel and hurtful, she'd still come back because of a dream. The generosity of it, the pure kindness, made him feel smaller than ever. "I owe you an apology," he said, stepping outside into the cold morning air. "What I said yesterday, there's no excuse for it. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I treated you terribly." Annie studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his words were genuine. "My grandfather says anger often comes from fear. What are you afraid of, Thomas?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What was he afraid of? The answer came to him immediately, though it was painful to admit. "I'm afraid that everything I've done here has been wrong," he said quietly. "I'm afraid that 18 months of my life have been wasted because I was too stubborn to listen. I'm afraid that I'm going to die out here, alone and forgotten, because I couldn't admit that maybe I don't know everything." Annie's expression softened slightly. "Fear makes people say things they do not mean. My grandfather understands this. That is why he sent me back." "He sent you back?" Thomas asked, surprised. He had another dream last night. He saw the yellow tears flowing again, but only if the white man learned to work with the spirits instead of fighting against them. "He said I should give you one more chance to listen." Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with overwhelming gratitude. This old man he'd never met was willing to help him again. Even after Thomas had insulted his granddaughter and rejected his guidance, it was more kindness than Thomas deserved. "I walked to the place upstream yesterday," Thomas said. "The spot with the granite rocks. I think I understand now why your grandfather dreamed about that location. The water flow is different there. It would naturally collect heavy materials." A small smile appeared on Annie's face. "You are beginning to see with different eyes. That is good. But seeing is only the first step. Now you must learn to work with the spirits of that place, not against them." "How do I do that?" Thomas asked. "First, you must ask permission," Annie explained. "The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. When we take something from it, we must ask properly and give something back in return." Thomas felt his old skepticism rising but forced it down. He'd tried everything else. His scientific methods had failed completely. What did he have to lose? By trying something different? "Will you show me?" he asked, and they nodded. "Get your tools, but bring only what you need. Too many tools, too much noise, and the spirits will hide the yellow tears from you." Thomas gathered his basic equipment, a pan, a small shovel, and a screen for sifting gravel. It felt strange to leave behind most of his gear, but he was committed to following Annie's guidance completely this time. They walked upstream together, in comfortable silence. The morning was crisp and clear, with frost still glittering on the grass and fallen leaves crunching under their feet. Thomas found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before, the way the light filtered through the trees, the sound the water made as it flowed around different obstacles, the feeling of the forest around them when they reached the granite outcropping. Annie stopped and stood quietly for several minutes, just listening. Thomas started to ask what she was doing, but something in her posture told him to wait and watch instead. "The spirits are here," she said finally, "but they are cautious. They remember how you worked before, with anger and impatience, taking without asking. We must show them that you have changed." She reached into her leather pouch and pulled out several small items. A pinch of tobacco, some colored stones, and what looked like dried herbs. She arranged these carefully on a flat rock near the water's edge, speaking softly in her native language as she worked. "What are you saying?" Thomas asked quietly. I am telling the spirits who we are and why we have come, Annie explained. I am promising that we will take only what we need and that we will give thanks for whatever we receive. I am asking them to help you understand the old ways. When she finished her ceremony, Annie turned to Thomas. Now you must make your own promise, not to me, but to this place and the spirits who guard it. Thomas felt awkward and self-conscious, but he knelt down beside the offerings Annie had made. He'd never done anything like this before, never spoken to spirits or asked permission from the earth. But something about the quiet beauty of this place made it feel natural. I don't know the right words, he said honestly. Speak from your heart, Annie advised. The spirits understand all languages. Thomas took a deep breath and tried to find the words. I'm sorry for the way I've been working. I was angry and impatient, and I didn't show respect for this place. I'm asking for your help now, and I promise to be grateful for whatever you're willing to share. As he spoke, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was just his imagination, but the place seemed to become more peaceful, more welcoming. The water sounded different, softer somehow. The morning light seemed warmer. Good, Annie said approvingly. Now we can begin to work. She led him to one of the deeper pools formed by the granite outcropping, where the water swirled slowly in. A natural eddy? This is where the heavy things come to rest, she explained. The water brings them here and leaves them as gifts for those who know how to look. Thomas knelt by the pool and carefully scooped up some of the dark sediment from the bottom. Even before he put it in his pan, he could see that it was different from anything he'd found at his usual digging sites. Heavier, more concentrated, with flecks of something that caught the light. Pan slowly, Annie instructed. Let the water do most of the work. You are not fighting against the stream now, you are working with it. Thomas followed her guidance, moving his pan in slow, gentle circles instead of the aggressive shaking he'd been doing before. The technique felt completely different, more like a dance than a battle. Water and sediment swirled together in the pan, gradually separating as the heavier materials settled to the bottom dop, and then Thomas saw it. Not just flecks this time, but actual pieces of gold. Tiny nuggets mixed in with the black sand, catching the morning sunlight like fallen stars. More gold than he'd found in his previous 18 months combined. Yellow tears, Annie said softly, watching his amazed expression. The spirits are pleased with your new attitude. Thomas stared at the gold in his pan, hardly believing what he was seeing. This is incredible. How did your grandfather know? He listens, Annie said simply. And now you are beginning to learn how to listen too. They worked together for the rest of the morning, with Annie teaching Thomas not just where to dig, but how to read the signs that told him where the gold was likely to be found. How to notice the subtle changes in watercolor that indicated heavy deposits. How to feel the difference in the weight of sediment samples. How to work with patience and respect instead of desperate urgency. By midday, Thomas had collected more gold than he'd dreamed possible. But more importantly, he'd learned something valuable about himself and about the different ways people could understand the world around them. As they prepared to head back to his cabin, Thomas looked at Annie with newfound respect and gratitude. Thank you, he said, for everything. For coming back, for giving me another chance, for teaching me how to listen. Annie smiled, and for the first time since she'd returned, the wariness was completely gone from her eyes. My grandfather will be pleased. He said the spirits were waiting for you to be ready to learn. Walking back through the forest, Thomas felt like a different person than the one who'd walked this same path that morning. He'd found gold, yes, but he'd found something even more valuable. He'd found humility and respect and the beginning of wisdom that could only come from opening his mind to new possibilities. The next 3 weeks changed everything. Thomas woke up each morning before dawn, eager to return to the sacred place by the granite rocks. Working alongside Annie, he learned not just where to find gold, but how to find it in ways that felt right and respectful. Each day brought new discoveries, and his small leather pouch grew heavier with yellow metal, but more than that, Thomas was learning things about himself and about life that no book had ever taught him. He discovered that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a practical tool that made his work more effective. When he stopped rushing and started listening to what the creek was telling him, everything became easier. Annie proved to be an amazing teacher. She showed him how to read the water like a book, understanding which pools would hold the most gold and which areas to avoid. She taught him to recognize the subtle signs that indicated rich deposits, the way certain rocks caught sediment, how the color of the water changed in deeper pools, even how the sound of the flowing creek could tell him about what lay beneath the surface. "Your books taught you to fight against the earth," she explained one morning as they worked side by side. "But my grandfather's way teaches you to dance with it. See how much easier everything becomes when you stop fighting?" She was right. Thomas found that the new methods required less physical effort but produced much better results. Instead of exhausting himself with aggressive digging and frantic panning, he learned to work steadily and calmly, letting the natural flow of the water do most of the work for him. By the end of October, Thomas had collected more gold than most prospectors found in years of work. His success was so dramatic that he could hardly believe it himself. The sacred place had lived up to every one of Annie's grandfather's promises. The yellow tears were flowing freely for someone who finally knew how to receive them properly. Word of Thomas's incredible luck began to spread, carried by Pete, the old prospector from downstream who had stopped by to check on Thomas before winter set in. Pete's eyes had nearly popped out of his head when he saw the amount of gold Thomas had collected. "Boy, I've been prospecting for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this," Pete said, hefting one of Thomas's gold-filled pouches. "What's your secret? Did you find some kind of mother lode up there?" Thomas glanced at Annie, who was sitting quietly by his fireplace, and smiled. "I had a good teacher," he said simply. Within a month, other prospectors started arriving at Willow Creek. They'd heard rumors about the amazing strike and wanted to try their luck in the area, but none of them found anything close to what Thomas was discovering. They dug frantically all around the granite outcropping, tearing up the landscape with their aggressive methods, but the spirits seemed to hide the gold from anyone who approached with greed and impatience. "Why doesn't it work for them?" Thomas asked Anne one evening as they watched a group of newcomers pack up their gear in frustration. "They take without asking," Annie explained. "They see only the gold, not the sacred place that holds it. The spirits give their gifts only to those who understand the proper way to receive them." As winter approached and the other prospectors headed south to escape the brutal cold, Thomas faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. He now had enough gold to return to Oregon as a wealthy man. He could buy a fine house, invest in businesses, live comfortably for the rest of his days. The dream that had brought him to Alaska had finally come true, but wealth wasn't the only thing Thomas had found at Willow Creek. He discovered friendship, wisdom, and a completely new way of understanding the world around him. He'd learned that some of the most valuable treasures couldn't be weighed or spent. "I want to share this with your grandfather," Thomas told Annie one snowy evening as they sat by his fire. "None of this would have happened without his guidance." "I owe him more than I can ever repay," Annie smiled warmly. "My grandfather will be pleased to hear this. But he would say that the gold was always here, waiting for you. He only helped you learn how to listen to what the earth was already trying to tell you." That winter, instead of returning to Oregon, Thomas decided to stay and learn more from Annie's people. He used part of his gold to buy supplies for Annie's village, ensuring they would have enough food and warm clothing to last through the harsh months ahead. He also hired Pete and several other experienced prospectors to help establish a proper mining operation that followed the old ways Annie had taught him. The arrangement benefited everyone. Thomas shared his wealth generously with those who helped him, but more importantly, he shared the knowledge Annie's grandfather had given him. He taught the other miners to approach their work with respect and patience, to ask permission from the spirits of each place, and to take only what they needed while giving thanks for what they received. By spring, the area around Willow Creek had become known throughout Alaska Territory as McKenna's Bend, named after the prospector who'd made the original discovery. But unlike most gold rush towns that sprang up quickly and died just as fast, this place was different. The mining was done sustainably, with respect for the land and the people who had lived there first. Thomas also convinced several families from Annie's village to establish a permanent trading post at McKenna's Bend. The indigenous knowledge about surviving in the wilderness proved invaluable to the miners who came from warmer climates. In return, the native families benefited from trade with the mining operation, creating a partnership that enriched both communities. But the most important change was in Thomas himself, the bitter, desperate man who had nearly starved alone in. His cabin was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true wealth came from community, respect, and wisdom. He never did return to teaching in Oregon, but he found himself educating people in ways that were far more meaningful than anything he'd done in a traditional classroom. Years later, when writers and historians came to document the story of McKenna's Bend, they were amazed by what they found. Unlike most mining operations that left behind devastated landscapes and bitter conflicts, this place had become a model of cooperation between different cultures and sustainable use of natural resources. The secret, Thomas would tell anyone who asked, was learning to listen. Most people come to Alaska thinking they know everything they need to know, he would say. But the land itself is the best teacher, if you're humble enough to learn from it. Annie eventually married a young man from a neighboring village, but she remained close to Thomas throughout his life, often bringing her children to visit the place where their friendship had begun. Her grandfather lived to be nearly 100 years old, long enough to see his dreams of cooperation between the white settlers and the native people become reality. Thomas never married, but he was never lonely. He became a father figure to many of the young miners who came to McKenna's Bend, teaching them not just how to find gold, but how to find wisdom, patience, and respect for the world around them. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the creek bubbled softly in the distance, Thomas would often sit by his fire and remember that first morning when the yellow tears had finally appeared in his pan. But what he treasured most wasn't the memory of finding gold, it was the memory of finding humility and discovering that sometimes the greatest treasures come from learning to listen to voices we never thought to hear. The gold had made him wealthy, but Annie's friendship and her grandfather's wisdom had made him rich in ways that money could never measure. And that, Thomas knew, was the most valuable discovery of all.